Welcome back to the Analysis.News. I'm Paul Jay, and I'm continuing my discussion with Denis Pilosh, who's in Ukraine, about the situation there and the geopolitics of this. And in this episode, or segment, we're going to talk more about NATO. Be back in a second. So now joining me again is Denis Pilosh. He's a political scientist, historian, translator. He's an activist of the Ukrainian Democratic Socialist Organization, the Social Movement, and a member of Commons, the Commons, a journal of social criticism. He's on the editorial board and co-author of the book, The Left Europe. Thanks again, Denis. Thank you for inviting. So let's go into this issue of NATO expansion. It seems, let me just put this as a thesis out here, some people are arguing this, that the Americans have created in Ukraine a kind of Afghanistan. In other words, suck Russia into an invasion of Ukraine. Now, Russia has its own agencies. They don't have to get sucked into anybody. And if they didn't have their own ambitions, they couldn't get sucked into something. And Putin is, I'm sure, a better chess player than probably most of the other people on the other side. At least he had been. That being said, did the Americans want this catastrophe? Did they arm Ukraine to the teeth as a provocation? Everyone knew that there wasn't a serious possibility of Ukraine being in NATO, certainly not at any time soon. But they wouldn't take it off the table. Did Putin step into something that will be a disaster and catastrophe both for Ukraine and for Russia? But as someone sitting here in California right now, it's a disaster for the world. One, it's taken climate crisis completely off the table. Mm-hmm. Everyone's getting back to fossil fuel, revving up the fossil fuel production in order to replace the Russian fossil fuel. And I got to say, I think one of the most dangerous things coming out of all this is the remilitarization of Germany. There's going to be a massive expansion in the German military budget. This is turning into a pre-World War I style shit show with nuclear weapons. And if Putin thought that this had anything to do with defending Russian security, I can't imagine how he thinks Russia is more secure at the end of all this. And a completely destroyed, if this goes on for weeks and weeks, and family after Ukrainian family leaves the country and many of the men and boys are killed. I mean, what is left on Russia's border, and they're going to occupy this? I mean, the whole thing is nuts, which is a reflection of the insanity of where global capitalism is right now. Anyway, it's a little bit of rant on my part, but it doesn't ever take the attention off. Right now, there's an invasion. Right now, civilians are getting killed. Soldiers on both sides are getting killed for no damn reason. But what's your take on sort of the bigger picture of this?
So I would say that I agree with the frame that this is a result of the crisis of the global neoliberal capitalism. And actually, this is like what Russia has done with this Ukrainian invasion is some way a continuation of what the US and its allies and satellites did with the Iraqi invasion. So I think that really Putin, like being a war criminal and doing this war crime of aggression, he follows in the steps of war criminals Bush and Blair and all others, and possibly he thought that he will face the same impunity that was the case with these Western imperialist powers doing pretty the same. So you have a unilateral invasion of the country, then you are finding and faking some pretext and justification why you did it. So now they even try to do the same with actually completely, if you know a bit about situation in Ukraine, it's completely absurd claims of some kind of weapons of mass destruction and so on. It was the same with Iraq, and then you do this humanitarian disaster, killing thousands of civilians, like immediately in the first weeks of invasion, and including many children and women and so on, and definitely non-competent people. And then you create something that will last for like a huge disaster for an entire region. So I'm afraid that yes, we can follow in these steps. So it's one of the worst case scenarios, of course, like after the full-scale world war with nuclear weapons or something like that. Again, what's similarly terrible scenario is being stuck into a prolonged war with continuous suffering and deaths of people. So if we get this like the Russian army that will constantly try to siege and shell cities and so on. So I think it's important from what perspective we are looking at the world system. So it's too much of concentrating on big players and seeing just some of them as some kind of counterbalance and so on, while they are really interlocked. And one could say that probably there are more German parts in Russian tanks than American rockets in some Ukrainian arms. So actually, all these sides were cooperating, and I would say that in the 90s, the new capitalist Russia under Yeltsin and then under Putin, it was conducting equally horrible crimes, for instance, in Chechnya, the wars in Chechnya, and it was tolerated by the so-called collective West. And again, when Russia was going on this authoritarian scenario, starting with President Yeltsin actually shooting on the parliament and then falsifying the elections and then handpicking Putin, it was everything okay for the West. And we also have these transcripts when of Yeltsin and Bill Clinton's talks, when Yeltsin says, just give me Eurasia and you can do everything you want, like in the rest of the world and so on. So again, it was this way of how to reshape these imperial spheres of influence. And I think that it was ultimately a goal of Putinist leadership has to become this part of the club, part of the this white colonizers club, and to like do the same what Americans and what the British and what all others can do in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And you see again how all these imperialist and sub-imperialist smaller players tried to do in Syria when Russia was bombing and Turkey was invading against the Kurdish population, and Saudis and Qataris had their own agendas and their own some kind of jihadist groups linked to them. So they were all using this the nation of Syria and Syrian people as some kind of battleground for their imperial ambitions and aspirations. So again, there is a lot of talk, for instance, that Russia had legitimate security concerns, but when I see here something like legitimate security concerns on the left, I just compare it to some official of Reagan administration saying that we have legitimate security concerns about Grenada and we can invade it. So we have legitimate security concerns about Central America. So we have to topple the Sandinista government and finance some far-right governments here, or to squeeze Cuba.
Oh, hold on. As much as I don't agree with the NATO argument, but just to be fair, and what Russia is saying in terms of legitimate security concerns is not they're afraid of Ukraine in and of itself. They're afraid of if Ukraine became a NATO country, if there were nuclear missiles on Ukrainian territory. That's what they're talking about. I mean,
it's what the US was talking about Cuba, that Russian like Soviet missiles and so on, and Grenada has some Cuban counterintelligence officers there, so we have to. So again, it explains the logic of each of these imperial powers, but it isn't the perspective I think that we need to look from. We need to look from the perspective of the people, like the people of all these countries, and how these smaller countries and their people, they have their own agency, of course, and they cannot be denied and seen just some kind of pawns in this game. But of course, the big players, and both Moscow and Washington or Beijing or New Delhi, or you can continue Ankara and so on, they try to use every situation in their own interests, their political interests and their economic interests. So obviously, the Western governments, the Western bourgeois governments, they had no genuine interest in like some like being real friends for Ukraine. Of course, they saw situation as some kind of tool for their own dealings and confrontations or with Russia, while ultimately, like Ukraine was set on its own to deal with this invasion. So actually, I would say that there is some kind of proxy war between NATO and Russia, because there are no NATO soldiers dying in Ukraine. There are Ukrainians dying in Ukraine, and again, there is no like Ukrainian offensive against Russia, and all the prior military build-up, contrary to what Russia claimed, there were independent international observers. They were pointing out that there is build-up on the Russian side, but there is no Ukrainian build-up for some kind of invasion or some kind of provocation and so on. So it was some kind of result of internal dynamic, probably political dynamic, or maybe something linked to some economic calculations, because the economic situation in both Russia and Ukraine was going pretty bad, and the prospects were again rather bad for the continuation. So it could push the Russian leadership these adventurous decisions.
If you look at who benefits, mm-hmm. It's all, as far as I can tell, sitting here, the U.S. and the West benefits is the one who benefits from all of this. They have a unified NATO, arms sales going through the roof. Germany practically doubling its military budget, but of course the U.S. will greatly increase their military budget. The military-industrial complexes of many countries are just smiling ear to ear. So are the fossil fuel companies, who love what's happened with the price of oil. and this last year of buildup of arms, if this is what's been going on, the Americans helping the Ukrainian government build its arms. You don't think there was a deliberate provocation here? I'll say it again. There's nothing made Putin fall for the provocation. But that being said, given how much it seems to me the West benefits from this, you don't think there was some deliberateness on their part? I mean, why not? I mean, if they wanted to avoid this, they could have just declared Ukraine's not coming into NATO, period. They could have declared that a long time ago.
But actually, again, you can turn the game and push point on Russia and saying that it was Russia that consolidated NATO. So why was this decision? They could predict the result. So why were they going into this trap? Because it was so obvious.
Yeah, it was so obvious. Every commentator was saying that as long as the 150,000 troops don't invade, he's dividing NATO. If they actually invade, he's uniting NATO. Everybody was saying that.
So yes, it's sometimes some kind of decisions. They aren't so rational in the perfect sense, and they also can stem from this the character, the nature of unchecked authoritarian power that has no real feedback from below, and that also too much relies on the information which is delivered in a way that like this leadership wants to hear. So they analyzing why the Russian army performed so poorly is because they had lots of problems with logistics and with like in general the readiness. So many are assuming doing this assumption that probably the picture of the situation and of the readiness in the West, in Ukraine and in Russia that was presented to Putin wasn't like adequate for the situation. And
well, it almost sounds like they really weren't planning to invade, and all of a sudden they were told go invade.
No, but they were concentrating these forces for months. But it seems that they really thought that they will have a smooth blitzkrieg in Georgia, like several days, and they capture some major cities, and then they can force Ukraine to capitulate, and everything is okay. And they don't have like a viable plan B for this. But returning to the question, who benefits? In the same way, you could say that at least in the part of its economic control actually over Russia, China is benefiting as well, because now Russia has nowhere to sell part of its fossil fuels, so it will have to rely heavily on the Chinese side, and the Chinese can lower the price and also do some more economic concessions, given that China has a powerful and dynamic economy, and Russia under the capitalist development, Russia was going more and more into this kind of petro state without, actually it started already under Brezhnev, but not in that scale that is now, when they when they try to, any kind of war is also for any military complex, not just Western ones, but the Russian one, like they did in Syria, that is some kind of manifesting that our weaponry that you can like purchase and so on, but it seems like even this Russian high-tech military stuff, it isn't so high-tech. So it's there are guys from like employee of the state service in Ukraine who uses an old Soviet Igla grenade launcher from the 70s, and he is like hitting this newest Russian jet. So again, it seems that like Russia's economy was really lagging on, and now it will be even more dependent on China as its primary partner in this situation.
It's kind of ironic because there's forces around Trump whether it's Trump the individual or not, but that are far-right American Christian nationalist forces, many who saw Putin as a defender of Christianity and an ally, which is why many of the people around Trump wanted to diminish the tension with Putin and Russia, because they really want to target China. And there's a very interesting speech that Steve Bannon gave to a group, a right-wing group that had a meeting in the Vatican a few years ago. And he talked about how there's a coming bloody war with Islam and atheist China. But even that's fallen apart in the sense that all they've done now is push Russia more towards China instead of being the ally of the American right, which against China. Now he's virtually could turn Russia into like a satellite of China, because where else are they going to go?
Again, there was a speech by a German admiral who was ultimately sacked, or when it leaked, when he said, "I'm a Christian, and as a Christian, I think that we must rely on Russia to fight the non-Christian Chinese." So yes, there is also this kind of thoughts.
Well, let me just end for now, but I'd like to talk again in the future soon. But as this is so insane on every side, there are so many forces acting it seems irrationally, but I guess that's not unusual in wars, because the only real rationality here is how much money all the oligarchs make out of war. But that being said, what does it make you feel? There's serious conversation now about the use of tactical nuclear weapons. It's like, I mean, it's beyond insane that they're talking about nuclear weapons as if they're just another weapon. They're not even using, people watch the analysis, they know I'm working with Daniel Ellsberg on this thing based on his book, Doomsday Machine, but you don't hear the phrase Doomsday Machine. They're talking about as if you could have tactical nuclear weapons. And one, it wouldn't cause devastation in the entire region. And two, somehow it gets contained and doesn't become all-out nuclear war. I mean, it's beyond an insanity. But you're there where they're talking about using tactical nuclear weapons.
And what's one of the most tragic issues is with what easiness, like some Western experts are speaking, as long as it concerns just Ukraine. So Putin may use nuclear weapons against Ukraine, as if it's some kind of second-class people. As long as it's not us, it's not a problem. And it's really after the tragedies of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it was an almost consensus that these weapons they shouldn't be used in any case. And yes, it was some justification for the storage of and amplifying the number of the nuclear weapons, as if they were some kind of containment, yes, and so on. But now we see that like the beast is unleashed, and the beast of this like nuclear war possible, and the nuclear non-proliferation is now also going to the dustbin. It seems as if again, if we speak about the context of the war in Ukraine, and then Kazakhstan and Belarus, they give up the remnants of the Soviet nuclear arsenal that were here, and we were like the third nuclear power accidentally, in exchange for this Budapest memorandum, in exchange for the guarantees of the security and territorial integrity and non-interference into the affairs of the country. And well, like the president was sad that this memorandum went to dustbin, and like Russia did what it did, and it again a unilateral aggression, and Russia being a nuclear power. And this only shows all the countries throughout the world that you need the nuclear weapons to prevent some kind of intervention. I'm afraid that again, and we have lots of other conflicts. We have India and Pakistan over Kashmir. We have the case of Iran and Israel. We have and so on and so on. So it may be like a start of a really terrible and disastrous way to how the world ends. But
so shouldn't Ukraine? I know this is not a very popular position, given Ukrainians are fighting and shedding blood right now. But shouldn't Ukrainian government declare now, no NATO, there'll never be nuclear weapons on Ukrainian soil? Why not take those two things off the table, not as part of negotiations, just unilaterally declare it?
I think that
because otherwise, how does this war ever end? I mean, it could go on for months.
It was said in the words of the president and the minister of foreign affairs. These things can be taken off the table, but they at the same time they are afraid of like doing this in a way that leaves Ukraine without any negotiating power. Actually, I'm afraid that that people are not sure whether what are the real intentions of the Russian side, and like all this stuff about demilitarization that can be given all the range of meanings that completely differ from each other. And I really think that like in such cases the optimal of course solution would be to demilitarize the aggressor, as it was with the US and Iraq, as it is Saudi Arabia against Yemen, or in this case with Russia against Ukraine. So of course it's the victim who pays this price for this, not the aggressor, unfortunately. I'm really not sure as if now Zelensky will say that we guarantee that we are outside NATO. And there were actually no real talks that it was more about some kind of rhetorical blackmail. Yes, that after the Budapest Memorandum is torn off, then we can feel free. But no one was seriously considering that there can be any kind of nuclear weapons in Ukraine, especially given our history with Chernobyl and so on. So I would say that it wasn't. It was never on the table.
But the Americans want to fight for the principle to the very last Ukrainian life.
Again, it tells a lot about the mood of imperial power. But the issue is that it's not the Americans who are fighting to. So unfortunately, we are pressured to the situation when, it seems that some reasonable negotiations from the side of Putinist autocracies, they will be only allowed either in case when they force a bigger invasion and then they grab a bigger chunk of Ukraine, or in the case when their invasion that is now already stalled, that it will be going down and they will have no other option as to finally get and to speak with the Ukrainians whom they called so much brothers but actually then unleashed the bombs and airstrikes on the heads of their brothers. So, but I was
just finally, what do you want from the international left? What position should they take?
Yeah. So I also wanted to address the issue that you also mentioned several times, that I think it's part of the solutions that we need also on the international left. The issue of the fossil fuels, and in general, if we look into the anatomy of lots of these aggressions, like Saudi Arabia and its criminal war in Yemen, or what the fossil fuel companies, the role they played in the Iraqi invasion, or that Russia being a fossil fuel empire, how it was intervening not just into Ukraine, but it also was using this its fossil fuels as a leverage against other Soviet states like Belarus, and then intervening to suppress the protests in Kazakhstan and Belarus and so on. It highlights the outcome of this is more fossil fuels. At the same time, we need to push for completely opposite, that if we had a democratic green transition more radical than the Green New Deal, something real eco-socialist alternative to the existing fossil fuel capitalism, it would obviously dismantle this current architecture of fossil fuel companies and fossil fuel empires with their aggressive wars. So this is also a part of the solution in the long term that can be proposed. But here and now, again, I can speak on behalf of my comrades and the people here, and the people in other countries. They can choose what suits them and what maybe isn't compatible with some of their convictions. But at this moment, it seems like Russia isn't going to stop. It isn't going to, even if Ukraine does some significant concessions and so on. So they are really pressuring and doing more and more more excesses against the civilian populations. So there were reports of some random shootings of people and so on. So we need this demand of the withdrawal of the Russian troops from Ukraine, and to actually to have a peace process, but not the gun near your head. So and pressure the leadership of Russia into this process. We need first, we need maximum support for the people of Ukraine. I mean, the humanitarian aid for the people who were affected by the war, a help for the refugees from Ukraine, meaning all people who had flee, notwithstanding with their origin and their citizenship. So again, this situation has already shown that there was more capacity in the West, in Europe, to greet refugees. And it highlighted that like refugees need to be treated humanely. And this is what has had to be done with the refugees from fleeing from Afghanistan, from Somalia, from Syria, from all other conflicts, especially those conflicts where European powers had their hand as well in. And I think that it should be now, when we see, obviously, for some obvious reasons, that Ukrainians are the poorest country in Europe, but they are still in Europe, so they are treated more humanely by the Europeans. So this has to be a template for all other refugees and asylum seekers, that we need really to rethink this system and to guarantee open borders for people who try to flee war and misery and death. Because we have governments like Boris Johnson in the UK who are like big friends of Ukrainian people, but due to their anti-migrant policies and anti-refugees policies, it's quite hard for Ukrainian seekers of asylum and refugees to get into this country. So we can see this hypocrisy, and people on the ground have to help, like all people from Ukraine, and giving their maximum assistance, and it means also helping all other refugees as well. So this is this issue. I would also argue that I understand that many people with pacifist convictions and people who think that any kind of continuing of Ukrainian resistance is somehow bringing closer some bigger conflict and so on. But I'm afraid that this is the case is that when Ukraine ceases to resist, its people are under the threat of ceasing to exist as an entity. Like the Russian side is really committing atrocities that cannot be justified. So this is why people of Ukraine need assistance, and including for their resistance, both military and non-violent. If you if you feel that you cannot support like any kind of weapons for Ukraine and so on, then you can concentrate on humanitarian issues. But still, you have not to just take Ukrainians from the picture as living people. So you need to understand the plight and the suffering of them. And in order to rebuild and recover, reconstruct the country after the war, we need a complete rethinking again of this neoliberal capitalist dogmas, and we need a cancellation of Ukrainian external debt. If we will succeed in this, again, this can be a template used for other countries, especially in the global south, that had been victims of this debt traps set by the international financial institutions. That then they can pressure for getting the same conditions they were forced in terms of war, in times of other complicated situations, to get all these loans to pay off the previous loans, and then all this fiscal austerity. So this has to be stopped, and this has to be stopped in the case of Ukraine as well. And our organizations with our comrades in the European left parties are now struggling for writing off Ukrainian debt and setting a precedent for all other peoples fighting against this. Again, to rebuild the country, you need funds from the same people. We need to take them from the people who robbed Ukraine, who robbed Russia, who robbed all our people, that are the capitalist class in our states.
So expropriate the oligarchs.
I would say, yes, that we need, contrary to these neoliberal measures that are seen as something without alternative by all our governments, and like Ukrainian government in specifically, we need to expropriate the oligarchs, expropriate their property, and turn it to recover rebuild the country, and also that property that is stored in tax havens, and I mean that assets that are in these tax havens, because even with these personal sanctions against Russian oligarchs and members of the Russian ruling class, they have lots of loopholes to use to get off with what they deprived their own people of. I would say that again, we need to check in general to challenge the system of imperialist powers. There is not one imperialism in the world. There are competing imperialists, and one shouldn't expect from some of these imperialist powers to bring on a more just world. They will just tore it apart to their more spheres of influence, but it wouldn't mean something of kind of democratic and egalitarian world order. And we need to stop this aggression, as we need to stop all other aggressions, and we need not to differentiate and to say this aggressor and this imperialist is better than that one. So notwithstanding, be it Western and American, be it Russian, be it Turkish, be it Saudi Arabian, they are bringing the same to the peoples whom they invade and whom they deprive of their lands and their lives. So I think we need to think in the terms of people, of ordinary people throughout the world, of common people, of those people in now in Ukraine. We have it's really these striking pictures of ordinary, common, working class people who get to try to stop Russian armed vehicles with their bare hands, and who try to somehow resonate those soldiers who were sent to kill them, that they don't have to be here, and they have to go home and probably to deal with their problem at home. So we have to deal with our biggest problem, that is this neoliberal capitalism in all countries. In our countries, it's obviously some kind of peripheral oligarchic capitalism, but I wouldn't say that Western capitalists are much nicer than our ones. So
no, these are if you want to talk war
same.
crime. Well, it's not even the same in the sense that no oligarchy or country has committed war crimes on the scale of the Americans.
Because they hadn't the tools.
It's not because they have evil DNA. It's a process of history. United States became the power, but they certainly have committed more crimes.
So
listen, I've said on air, I'm a dual citizen. I have Canadian and U.S. citizenship, and I've said a few times, if Canada could be the imperial hegemon, they would jump at it. If the elite Canadian elites, just not the cards they have. Anyway, Dennis, thanks very much, and we'll do this again. I hope soon. Please stay safe. As you can while you're out there doing your work.
Try.
Okay, and thank you for joining us on the Analysis.News.